Let's take an in-depth look at the methodology steps and some of the tools in the AIM toolkit to see why AIM is such a powerful and practical framework for implementation. What exactly makes an implementation successful? In our 25 years with global industry leaders, we've observed a common barrier to change. It's what we term the difference between installation and implementation. Many organizations fall victim to the installation trap, but you don't get all the benefits of your change with just installation. Your changes must be fully implemented. For any business change project to be considered successful, it must achieve 5 distinct metrics. It must be delivered on time, on budget, all technical objectives met, all business objectives met, and all human objectives met. Let's use the example of new technology because it's easy to see the difference between installing this change and implementing it. You know installation, the lights come on, the technology works, but unless the technology is adopted and used to full functionality, what have you really achieved? Not value realization. You've installed, but not implemented. On time, on budget, all technical objectives met, that's installation. Installation is critical, but it's not enough. You don't get benefits of the change unless the new ways are actually adopted on a sustained basis. We also need to achieve the business objectives and the human objectives. The human objectives are the observable new behaviors, what people will be doing differently as a result of this strategic change. Unless people are behaving differently in some way, you haven't changed anything, and there's no real implementation. So let's look at the AIM methodology and how it guides your project and your organization to getting to full implementation and return on investment. AIM is a structured framework, it's repeatable, and it is a system. The pieces are designed to work together: principles, tools, strategies, and tactics. It isn't a series of checklists and templates that become a check-the-box activity. Think of AIM as a risk dashboard for the human elements. The methodology helps us identify where the implementation risks and opportunities are so that we can mitigate those risks and implement at an accelerated pace. It's also designed to be systemic so that AIM becomes the way that your organization operates and gets things done every day. Whether you are implementing new processes, new technology, restructuring, integrating an acquisition, whether your change is straightforward or transformational in scope, AIM is the implementation framework, how things get done. Who are involved in these changes? Here's our cast of characters. Champions, those people who support the change but don't have the authority to make it happen. Agents, those individuals who are called on to implement the change and are evaluated based on their ability to get the change implemented. Sponsors, the AIM approach puts a great deal of emphasis on the individuals who are leading the change. In fact, we say that sponsorship is the single most important factor in ensuring swift and successful implementation. For every change, we have 2 types of sponsors: authorizing sponsors and reinforcing sponsors. The authorizing sponsors are the leaders who authorize the change and provide the required resources, the time, budget, equipment, and people. But these individuals alone can't ensure the change is adopted. Additionally, at each level of the organization, we also have managers who act as reinforcing sponsors with their own direct reports. We'll talk more about how important these sponsors are to implementation success. And let's not forget the targets, those people most impacted by the change and who must adopt the new behaviors. Keep in mind that in any change, people may play more than one role. For example, your reinforcing sponsors may also be change agents. So we have the roles. What's the process? What you see here is called the AIM roadmap. We can look at the methodology in various ways, but this is a simple picture. Each of these steps has tools and deliverables associated with it. The first step is to define the change. So, going back to the 5 best practice success metrics we talked about a minute ago: on time, on budget, all business, technical, and human objectives met, We identify and include all of those objectives when we define the change. The AIM change definition process is comprehensive and goes well beyond what you're likely doing through your project chartering process. Especially when we begin to flesh out the human objectives, the behaviors we seek to see in the future state. If we don't identify these required behavioral changes up front, we can't measure adoption of the behaviors on the back end, and we can't develop implementation-specific reinforcements for those behaviors. It bears repeating. If there's no behavioral change, there is no implementation. In defining the change, we're also looking at the gap between the current state and the future state so that we can identify the required resources from getting to where we are today to the end point. Think of it this way. If you're going from New York to Miami, it will take you X amount of resources to get there. But if you're going from New York to Sydney, Australia, those resource requirements will increase exponentially. We have tools and templates to support defining the change, and the final deliverable is what we call the business case for action, which becomes the foundation for our communication plan. This business case for action must get translated so that it is meaningful for each group of targets for the change. Next, we need to look at developing change agent capacity. Implementation takes place at the local level, and we need prepared local agents with the right skills, traits, and characteristics in the right numbers and in all the right places, meaning in every area that is impacted by the change. The Change Agent Assessment Tool helps us make sure we aren't selecting people who have subject matter expertise but lack the interpersonal skills needed for this critical role. The next AIM step is to assess the climate. We look at two major components, past history and what else is going on that's competing for the limited resources available. This is the climate in which the change is taking place, and no change occurs in isolation. It occurs in the context of all the other things going on in your organization. These include all the other projects that are competing for resources and mind share of the sponsors, agents, and targets. Generate sponsorship. The single most important activity in getting sustained adoption of the changes is building the cascade of sponsors who are expressing, modeling, and reinforcing the change with their direct reports on a daily basis. As change agents, our primary focus is to build this cascade of executives and managers at each level of the organization that reinforce the change. Good sponsorship requires both action by leaders and positional authority. And we can actually measure the quality of our sponsorship on a change by using the Sponsorship Assessment Tool. Determine Change Approach, the next step, identifies which components of the change are compliance-driven and which are commitment-driven. How we implement compliance, like regulatory-driven changes, is different from changes where we need to win the hearts and minds, the commitment of our reinforcing sponsors and targets. The project you're working on may have elements of both. It's not a question of what's right or wrong, but the approach is different. Hammer for compliance, transition management for commitment. I hope you're starting to see that AIM is about getting things done. If we can't execute, we have no way of knowing whether our strategy was right. If we can't execute, it doesn't matter how good the strategy is. We have to use the finite resources we're given efficiently, and AIM guides us to the best ways to make this happen. Develop target readiness is the next step. So readiness is focused on identifying and managing the sources of resistance. You will always have resistance for any change you are implementing. The more disruptive your change is, the more resistance you will have. We can measure readiness of targets with the individual readiness assessment. Armed with this information, we can use AIM tactics and strategies to help manage the resistance that can otherwise slow down the implementation. But don't try to combat or eliminate resistance. It's inevitable that you will have resistance whether you think your change is positive or negative. The next step is to build the communication plan. We have to communicate what this change is all about. One of the most common mistakes organizations make is to focus almost entirely on communications, thinking that if we just give people the rationale, they will see the wonderful logic of our change. But don't get confused. A communication plan is not an implementation plan. Those are not synonymous. The AIM steps and deliverables address so much more than just the development of a communication plan. And by the way, if all you're doing is communicating from the top down, you are probably creating even more resistance. The AIM approach is to deliver the right message at the right time to the right audience, tailored to the needs of that specific audience. And every communication should have a feedback loop, a way to gather data back from the targets so that you have input into what you need to do to manage the resistance. Are you seeing the cyclical nature of AIM? Do you see why it's an integrated system? Sponsorship is linked to readiness, is linked to communication and reinforcement. It's how change actually happens. It's cyclical. We are always going back and forth across the roadmap based on what's going on right now on the ground. And that's why methodologies that focus on checklists and templates rather than principles aren't as effective. Let's talk about reinforcement for a minute. Your reinforcement strategy is the menu of positive reinforcements and negative consequences the reinforcing sponsors will apply with their direct reports on a daily basis to reinforce the new behaviors. This reinforcement is the most powerful weapon in getting adoption of your change. The power comes from sponsors that are consistent in what they say, what they do, and what they reinforce. For example, if sponsors talk about quality as the most important value, but model and reinforce cost-cutting, there is inconsistency. When we have inconsistencies between what the leaders say and what they do, and what they reinforce, there's confusion. While other approaches miss the importance of reinforcement, AIM places great attention on this critical step because it is, in fact, the driving force for fast implementation. There is no behavior change unless we change the reinforcements. The next major step of the methodology addresses the cultural component of the change. Culture, the way things get done in your organization, is a powerful force. What we need to determine is whether your changes are consistent with the culture or not. You can either change the change or change the culture. AIM is not about theory. AIM gives you practical business methods, tactics, and strategies for driving the culture change into the real work of the organization. The last step, prioritize action, is about blending the implementation plan with the project plan. AIM is not applied in a rigid way. It's not a forced lockstep approach. You use the steps and tactics you need based on your specific situation. That's what we call fit for purpose. That said, there are 5 key steps that apply to every change. They are: define the change, generate sponsorship, develop target readiness, build a communication plan, and develop a reinforcement strategy. These 5 steps are always in play for every project, every business change, no matter what the size, scope, or complexity. AIM captures all the critical elements needed to implement a change. It's scalable and flexible and deliverables focused. It's a repeatable and highly practical approach to executing the changes in your organization that will drive your projects to adoption and value realization. There is so much more to know about AIM principles, tactics, strategies, and the AIM measurement diagnostics. We'll help your organization through our consulting, learning, and accreditation services. If you have a mission-critical project, we'll help you implement it faster. If you're in the middle of a troubled project, we'll help you turn it around. If you need the capability to implement changes of every size and scope, we'll build your capacity. And if you need to increase efficiency with a standardized approach to implementing change, we'll show you how AIM will benefit your organization. Contact us now.